I didn't mean to send it. The words flashed on my phone screen as my thumb hovered over the delete button, but it was already too late. Emily Parker, 28, sitting in a tiny corner booth at Java Haven, coffee cooling beside her, heart racing like a drumline during halftime. She had typed in frustration after a brutal morning of missed deadlines and a boss who wouldn't stop texting, fingers flying over the screen without thinking, sending a text that would change everything. Across the city, in a penthouse overlooking the skyline, Victor Romano, the 60-year-old Mafia boss known for his icy composure and meticulous control over everything he touched, read the words with a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Not anger, not outrage, just interest. He tilted back in his chair, the city lights reflecting off the glass of his office window, the world quiet around him except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant pulse of traffic far below. Emily's phone buzzed again, a simple notification, but the message she'd sent had already set events into motion she couldn't possibly predict. She froze, realizing she had no idea how to retract what she had typed, no way to unsend the message that had breached the invisible barrier between her life and a man whose reputation could crush her with a single decision. Her coffee steamed in the cold morning air, mingling with the tension curling in her chest, sweat prickling at her temples despite the crisp temperature outside. Across town, Victor's sharp blue eyes, a storm contained in steel, scanned the text and considered the woman behind it. He didn't need to know her name yet, didn't need to know her life, but the audacity, the mistake, the raw unfiltered honesty of her frustration drew him in like a moth to flame. The rest of the world could wait. He typed a response slowly, deliberately, words measured, careful, and in Emily's tiny cafe, her phone buzzed again. She glanced down, expecting an apology or a correction from whoever had received the text by mistake, and instead saw a message from a number she didn't recognize. "We need to talk," it read. The simplicity of it made her stomach drop, an icy realization that the wrong message had reached exactly the right person. She tried to gather her composure, pulling the phone to her chest as though it could shield her from the consequences of her own fingers, and in that moment, the hum of the city outside seemed to dim, the noise fading into a quiet that amplified the rapid drumbeat of her pulse. She looked around the cafe, noticing the mundane details she had ignored before, the scuffed wooden floor, the neon glow of the sign outside, the half-empty sugar container, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped in a loop of what-ifs. The words she had sent were innocent in her intent, rebellious perhaps, a fleeting vent against the pressures of her day, yet they carried weight she hadn't anticipated. Minutes later, another buzz, another line of text. "Meet me tonight. 8 p.m. No excuses." Her breath caught. 8 p.m. That gave her just enough time to panic, to question every decision that had led to this point, to wonder if she could undo a mistake she didn't even fully understand yet. The cafe's bell jingled as someone entered, coffee orders rattling in the background, but Emily barely noticed. The world had narrowed to a single point of tension, her mistake on a screen and the man who now held the power to turn her ordinary morning into something extraordinary, terrifying, and unavoidable. Her hands shook slightly as she slid the chair back and stood, her phone clutched like a lifeline. Outside, the sunlight glinted off wet sidewalks, a reminder that everything, every choice, every accidental text, had consequences she couldn't ignore. And as she walked, the city towering around her, Emily Parker felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation, the kind that made her pulse quicken and her mind race, a mistake poised to rewrite the rules of her life entirely, while somewhere high above, Victor Romano considered exactly how he would use that accidental message to draw her into a world she had never imagined, a world where every glance, every word, every action carried the weight of power, and in that moment, the ordinary and the extraordinary collided, all from a single, unintended tap of her thumb. Emily Parker paced along the narrow streets of downtown Manhattan, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as if it could shield her from the consequences she had yet to understand. The city hummed around her, the morning sun glinting off glass towers, taxis honking, the distant rumble of construction filling the gaps between thoughts racing faster than she could organize them. She tried to calm herself, breathing deeply, the scent of fresh coffee and damp asphalt mingling in the air, but the words from the unknown number echoed relentlessly, "Meet me tonight. 8 p.m. No excuses." Her pulse quickened as she realized the audacity of the message, the authority behind it, and the impossibility of simply ignoring it. She glanced at her reflection in a polished shop window, noticing her green eyes wide and alert, her chest tightening with a mixture of fear and anticipation, the hum of the city fading into the background as her mind imagined every possible scenario, none of which felt safe. She adjusted her coat against the brisk wind, forcing herself to slow her steps as the sidewalks became crowded with morning commuters, their chatter a dull white noise she barely registered. Across the city, in his high-rise office overlooking the skyline, Victor Romano leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled, watching security cameras and city maps with meticulous precision, though his attention was fixed entirely on the woman who had unknowingly disrupted the controlled rhythm of his morning. Every detail mattered to him, from the tension in her posture to the slight tremor in her fingers as she adjusted her coat, from the way she kept glancing over her shoulder to the careful measurement of her steps. He did not rush, he did not panic, yet the plan unfolding in his mind moved with the certainty of an experienced strategist. By the time Emily reached her apartment, a modest walk-up with a view of brick facades and fire escapes, she felt the weight of anticipation pressing against her ribs, the normalcy of her life contrasting sharply with the magnitude of what awaited her. She fumbled with keys, the metal cool against her palm, unlocking the door with trembling hands, stepping inside, and pausing just long enough to glance at the familiar surroundings, the worn couch, the stack of unpaid bills, the small kitchen with the faint scent of last night's dinner, all grounding her briefly before reality intruded again. She set her bag down, phone still in hand, and leaned against the counter, staring at the screen as if it held the answer to the storm building in her mind. 8 p.m. seemed impossibly distant and yet imminent, each minute stretching endlessly as her imagination ran wild with scenarios that could not be predicted. She tried to focus on mundane tasks, straightening the living room, pouring water into a glass, counting breaths to steady herself, but nothing could fully remove the knot of tension coiling tighter with every passing moment. Meanwhile, Victor observed, calculated, and prepared, his mind rehearsing interactions, testing possibilities, and predicting reactions, not out of malice, but because control was everything in his world, and the woman who had texted him inadvertently had entered that world, whether she was ready or not. Emily finally sank onto the edge of her couch, phone in lap, fingers tracing the screen idly, thinking of all the things she might have done differently, all the precautions she might have taken, yet knowing deep down that it was too late, that a single mistake had pulled her into a narrative she could not escape. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious to the unfolding tension, unaware of the connection forming between two lives set on an unlikely collision course. She could feel it in the way her pulse raced, the way the room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker, as though the day itself were holding its breath, waiting for the evening to arrive and for the first real encounter to begin, a meeting that would test her composure, challenge her assumptions, and alter the trajectory of everything she had known up to this point. The sun dipped lower behind the skyscrapers, casting long shadows across the streets of Manhattan, and Emily Parker found herself walking with purpose toward the appointed café, every step deliberate despite the jittering in her stomach. Her green eyes scanned the sidewalks, noting the patterns of pedestrians, the glint of street signs, the subtle rhythm of city life, each detail grounding her as she approached the small, upscale coffee shop where the meeting had been set. Inside, the aroma of freshly brewed espresso mingled with the soft hum of conversation and the occasional clink of porcelain, but Emily hardly noticed, her focus entirely on the unknown man she was about to meet. She slid into a corner booth, tucking her purse beside her, the leather cool under her fingers, and glanced at her phone again, no new messages, just the silent anticipation building with every tick of the clock on the wall. Moments later, the door opened, and the bell above jingled softly, drawing her gaze instinctively toward the entrance, and there he was. Victor Romano, standing in the doorway, tall, commanding, every movement precise, from the way he adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit to the measured pace of his stride across the polished floor. The city lights reflected in his steel blue eyes, and even without a word, his presence filled the room, shifting the energy, drawing attention, though none of the other patrons seemed aware of the subtle gravity of his aura. He stopped a few feet from her booth, and the faint scent of cedarwood and something sharp in the air marked his proximity. Emily's pulse quickened, not out of fear in the conventional sense, but from the intensity of being observed so thoroughly, every detail measured, every motion catalogued. He slid into the seat across from her without a word, letting the silence stretch, giving her a moment to take in the depth of his gaze, the slight furrow at his brow, the calm assurance radiating from every line of his posture. "You sent the message," he said finally, his voice deep, resonant, controlled, carrying authority without aggression. Emily nodded, fingers tightening around her coffee cup, wishing she could explain, apologize, retract, anything to bridge the gap between the accidental text and the man seated before her. Victor's lips curved slightly, not a smile, but an acknowledgement of the unintentional boldness that had reached him. I read it, he continued, each word deliberate, and I decided to see who had the audacity to type it. Emily swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment. The ordinary act of sending a message transformed into something monumental, and for the first time, she realized that her morning frustration had inadvertently crossed into a world far beyond her ordinary routines. Outside, the sky darkened to a rich amber, the last light reflecting on glass towers, and inside, the café seemed insulated, the sounds of the city fading to a distant murmur, leaving only the measured ticking of the wall clock and the unspoken dialogue between two people drawn together by chance, a text message, and the gravity of circumstances neither could have predicted. Emily felt a strange mixture of apprehension and curiosity, her mind racing with questions, scenarios, and the weight of inevitability, and Victor, silent, observant, allowed her to feel the tension, guiding the interaction without speaking further, knowing that the smallest gestures, the subtlest cues, would carry the conversation further than words could in these first moments, each heartbeat marking the start of an encounter that would redefine their lives, the ordinary world outside. Continuing its rhythm, unaware of the pivotal intersection occurring in a quiet corner booth. Emily Parker sat back in her chair, the warmth of the coffee cup seeping through her palms as she tried to steady her racing thoughts. The cafe around her seemed to contract, the chatter of other patrons fading into the background as Victor Romano observed her with a quiet intensity that made the space between them feel charged. She noted the precise way he held himself, shoulders squared, posture relaxed yet undeniably commanding, the lines of his tailored suit catching the soft light from the hanging fixtures. He did not rush to speak again, letting the silence linger, and in that silence, Emily felt every subtle shift of energy, every faint gesture, every measured blink as though they were communicating without words. The faint hum of the espresso machine, the occasional clink of a spoon against porcelain, the soft murmur of conversation from nearby tables, all of it contrasted sharply with the tension coiling between them, making each breath feel deliberate and heavy. She twisted a ring on her finger nervously, green eyes meeting his steel blue gaze, noticing how it lingered on details, not missing anything, cataloging every expression and movement. Victor finally leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table, voice low, measured, yet carrying an authority that demanded attention without force. I want to understand you, he said, and the simplicity of the words struck her, the way they were free from judgment yet impossible to ignore. Emily opened her mouth, considered a response, then thought better of it, letting the moment hang, realizing that saying too much or too little could tip the balance. She was acutely aware of her surroundings, the way the afternoon light shifted through the large windows, casting patterns across the table, across her face, highlighting the tension and anticipation coiled like a spring inside her chest. Outside, the city continued in its relentless rhythm, the distant wail of sirens, the hum of traffic, the echo of footsteps on the pavement blending into a steady background pulse that contrasted with the heightened awareness she felt, every sense focused inward yet aware of every subtle cue from Victor. He watched her adjust her posture, the way she took in her surroundings, noting the way her fingers flexed around the cup, the slight tremor in her hands betraying her attempt to maintain composure. There was an unspoken rhythm to the interaction, a measured dance of observation and subtle influence, where neither spoke unnecessarily but both conveyed volumes through presence alone. Emily realized that the ordinary patterns of her life, the commute, the coffee breaks, the routine exchanges with strangers, had been replaced by an acute awareness of consequence, that every choice, every glance, every gesture now carried weight far beyond what she had ever known. Victor's gaze softened fractionally, enough to signal attention without concession, and in that subtle shift, Emily felt a flicker of connection, a bridge forming between their worlds, disparate yet drawn inexplicably together by chance and circumstance. The minutes stretched, the sun lowering further, shadows lengthening across the wooden floor, and Emily Parker felt the first real sense of understanding that this encounter was the beginning of something that would test her patience, challenge her assumptions, and quietly, inevitably, change the trajectory of her life in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. The afternoon light shifted imperceptibly, stretching longer shadows across the polished wood floors of the cafe, and Emily Parker felt the pull of the city around her, the distant rumble of subway trains, the intermittent honk of taxis, blending into a rhythmic backdrop that mirrored the tension coiling in her chest. She stirred her coffee absently, the warmth seeping into her fingers, grounding her as her mind replayed the brief but intense exchange with Victor Romano, every detail sharp, every gesture weighted with significance. Victor did not speak immediately, his presence quiet yet undeniably authoritative, his eyes tracking her movements with an almost imperceptible curiosity that made her aware of herself in ways she had never experienced. She noticed the faint crease at the corner of his eyes, the subtle way his hands rested lightly on the table, and the steadiness in his breathing that contrasted with the quickening pulse in her own chest. Every so often, he adjusted his suit jacket, the movement fluid, deliberate, signaling control without the need for words. Emily tried to focus on the mundane, the clinking of cups, the gentle murmur of conversation around them, but it was impossible. Every subtle shift in Victor's expression seemed magnified, every glance a measured assessment. She felt a flutter of apprehension mingled with intrigue, a sensation that made her stomach tighten and her hands flex unconsciously around the ceramic cup. Victor finally leaned slightly forward, voice calm, low, deliberate, yet carrying an unspoken command. I want to know what drives you, Emily. Not your job, not the routine of your day, but what moves you, what keeps you awake at night. His words lingered in the air, creating a space of reflection that Emily had not anticipated, a challenge and an invitation wrapped into a single sentence. She inhaled slowly, the scent of coffee and the faint undertone of cedarwood from his cologne blending into an oddly comforting presence, and for the first time felt the tension shift subtly, a delicate interplay of observation and understanding. She responded cautiously, choosing words with care, yet aware that even a misstep might disrupt the fragile balance of this encounter. Outside the large windows, the city moved with indifferent rhythm, the sun dipping lower, reflecting gold and orange hues off glass towers, a contrast to the concentrated intensity of the quiet booth where two lives were beginning to intersect in ways neither had anticipated. Emily felt the realization settle in, the understanding that a single, accidental text had unraveled the ordinary pattern of her life and drawn her into a space charged with anticipation and the potential for transformation. Victor's gaze softened fractionally, acknowledging the tentative bridge forming between them, a recognition of her presence and the complexity of the person sitting across from him, and Emily, sensing the subtle shift, felt a flicker of courage, a willingness to engage in this uncharted interaction, to explore the unspoken possibilities contained in the pause between words, in the measured observation, in the quiet moments where attention and intent intertwine to create an unspoken connection. That would guide the next steps of a day that had already begun with chaos and now hummed with the possibility of unexpected, profound change. The city lights were beginning to sparkle against the twilight sky, casting a golden shimmer across wet streets and reflecting in the windows of the cafe where Emily Parker sat, her mind racing with the implications of the conversation she had just shared with Victor Romano. The hum of the espresso machine and the gentle murmur of other patrons seemed to fade into the background as she focused entirely on the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the way his eyes moved across her face, noting each flicker of emotion, each micro-expression, the quiet control in his posture that contrasted with the rapid beating of her own heart. She sipped her coffee slowly, the warmth anchoring her as she processed the mixture of curiosity and apprehension stirring within her, and she realized that every instinct she had relied upon in her orderly life suddenly felt inadequate, her thoughts too fast, her awareness heightened. Victor, seated across from her, leaned back slightly, his fingers interlacing on the table, the tailored navy suit falling perfectly along his broad shoulders, a study in controlled power, every movement deliberate, purposeful, measured, and yet without the need for dominance in the conventional sense. He spoke again, voice low, steady, resonating in the quiet space between them. I want to ensure you are safe, and the simplicity of the statement held more weight than any overt gesture could, suggesting both awareness of potential hazards and a quiet offer of guidance without expectation. Emily glanced down at her hands, flexing her fingers around the cup, noticing the slight tremor she could not suppress, and felt a faint flicker of reassurance in the careful attentiveness of his presence, the attention that was neither intrusive nor dismissive but precise, measured, and protective in a way that drew her in while maintaining a respectful distance. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, the shadows of passers-by dancing across the sidewalk, cars moving steadily, oblivious to the heightened awareness and subtle exchanges occurring inside, and Emily felt both the thrill and the unease of a life temporarily paused, suspended in a moment that seemed delicate and infinitely stretched, as if the city itself conspired to slow the world for the small, quiet significance of their encounter. Victor observed her, noting the slight inclination of her head, the furrow of her brow as she considered his words, the careful, tentative movements of someone adjusting to unexpected attentiveness, and he allowed silence to bridge the gaps between questions, letting the pauses communicate as much as the words themselves. Emily felt the gravity of being seen, truly observed, by someone accustomed to precision and influence, and the tension of the unknown mingled with a growing awareness of safety, interest, and the inexplicable draw toward a person whose life was measured in decisions far beyond the ordinary, whose presence now framed the world around her in a subtle, potent contrast of power and attention. The café seemed to shrink around them, every clink of a spoon, every soft murmur amplified, and Emily realized the ordinary had been displaced by an intensity she could not yet define, the interplay of focus, control, and gentle oversight creating a space in which her instincts and his observations danced, quietly negotiating boundaries and possibilities, and as she set down her cup, she sensed that the trajectory of her evening, and perhaps her life, had been irreversibly altered, guided by the deliberate care of a man who understood the weight of presence, observation, and influence, and who had chosen to place it, subtly, intentionally, into the hands of someone who had entered his world through a single, accidental message. The city outside had grown quieter as night settled over the streets, streetlights casting long, narrow pools of amber across the wet pavement, reflecting in Emily Parker's wide, alert eyes as she walked beside Victor Romano toward a quieter avenue lined with cafes and small shops closing for the evening. Her steps were cautious, measured, yet driven by a mixture of anticipation and the lingering tension of the afternoon encounter, the echo of his words still resonating in her mind, the quiet authority of his voice carving its way into her consciousness. Victor's presence beside her was unmistakable, the subtle scent of cedarwood and leather signaling both refinement and attentiveness, his stride deliberate, confident, a rhythm that contrasted sharply with the erratic beat of her own pulse. The city seemed to fade into the background, the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog blending into a soft, unobtrusive backdrop that allowed the intensity of the moment between them to dominate every sense. Emily noticed the slight tilt of his head, the careful way his eyes observed not just her but the environment around them, anticipating potential hazards with a quiet precision that made her aware of the protective yet unobtrusive role he assumed without explicit command or pressure. They paused at a small park bench under a lamppost, its light warm against the cool evening air, and Victor gestured to it with a subtle nod, inviting her to sit, not as an authority demanding compliance but as an acknowledgement of mutual presence, a shared space where observation and attention were enough to establish connection. Emily lowered herself onto the bench, taking in the rhythm of his movements, the slight flex of his fingers as they rested on his knees, the way he scanned the environment with a calm deliberation that contrasted with the heightened awareness she felt in every nerve ending. She let her hands rest loosely in her lap, the warmth from the pockets of her coat a small comfort against the chill, and found herself taking in the details of his appearance, the crisp lines of his tailored suit, the subtle glint of cufflinks in the lamplight, the calm focus in his steel blue eyes. Victor spoke again, voice low, measured, yet carrying a weight that made every word deliberate. "The world can be unpredictable," he said, "but you have a way of navigating it that I find interesting." Emily hesitated, unsure how to respond, then allowed a small nod, the acknowledgement of observation, curiosity, and recognition passing between them in the absence of further words. Around them, the park seemed still, the distant sounds of the city softened, creating a cocoon of clarity in which attention, presence, and subtle interaction carried the weight of unspoken understanding. Emily felt a rare sensation of being fully observed without judgment, the careful watchfulness of Victor Romano creating an invisible framework that both constrained and protected, shaping the rhythm of her breathing, the pacing of her thoughts, and the unfolding awareness that her accidental text had set in motion an encounter charged with deliberate attention, potential, and the quiet unfolding of connection that neither had fully comprehended yet. She exhaled slowly, letting the cool air fill her lungs, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease slightly, while still acutely aware that every gesture, glance, and word in the moments ahead would shape the trajectory of their interaction, a subtle interplay of observation, presence, and influence guiding them toward an understanding that had begun with chance and continued in the deliberate, measured rhythm of the night. Emily Parker felt the evening air brush against her face as the city lights deepened into a rich indigo, reflecting off puddles from an earlier drizzle, each step she took beside Victor Romano a measured dance between curiosity and caution. The streets were quieter now, the distant hum of traffic softened, and the occasional flicker of neon signs painted subtle patterns on the sidewalk, creating an almost cinematic backdrop for the conversation that had grown more deliberate, more intimate in its unspoken intensity. They paused near a small fountain in a tucked-away square, the gentle gurgle of water a counterpoint to the stillness enveloping them, and Victor leaned slightly, observing her with a calm, analytical gaze that made every micro-expression, every subtle movement, seem magnified. Emily noted the steadiness of his breathing, the slight tilt of his head as he catalogued her reactions, the deliberate way he adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, and she felt a mixture of apprehension and intrigue tightening in her chest, a sense that every word, every pause, every glance carried significance beyond the ordinary. She shifted slightly, the faint sound of her coat brushing against the bench breaking the silence, and he allowed the pause to linger, letting the space between them convey as much as any spoken sentence could. "You are cautious," he said finally, voice low and deliberate, carrying weight without force, and Emily felt the timbre of his observation settle in, a quiet recognition of her careful attention and guarded instincts. She nodded subtly, aware that her body language was being read, interpreted, noted, yet felt strangely safe in the careful neutrality of his attention. Around them, the square was deserted, a few late pedestrians passing by, their footsteps echoing softly, yet within this pocket of the city, time seemed to stretch, each heartbeat, each inhalation a reminder of the unexpected gravity of the encounter, the subtle negotiation of presence, power, and curiosity unfolding without overt assertion. Emily flexed her fingers around the edge of the bench, green eyes meeting his steel blue gaze, noticing the slight softening at the corners, the careful attentiveness that did not impose but invited engagement, a bridge forming in silence, in subtle shifts and shared awareness. The fountain's water reflected the muted glow of streetlights, creating patterns that danced across the cobblestones and the surrounding foliage, and Emily felt a rare sense of being both observed and protected, the paradoxical mixture of intensity and care settling around her like a quiet current. Victor spoke again, voice calm, resonant, carrying deliberate weight. "The choices we make, even by accident, often reveal more than we expect," and Emily absorbed the words, feeling the reflection of her own actions mirrored in his observation, understanding the depth of the attention and the understated guidance offered. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension in her shoulders ease slightly, appreciating the deliberate pacing of the encounter, the absence of rush, the measured observation that framed her world differently for the first time in years. Around them, the city carried on, oblivious to the charged stillness, and Emily Parker, seated beside Victor Romano, felt the subtle shift of ordinary into extraordinary, the awareness that every microgesture, every quiet look, and every considered word was shaping an interaction that had begun with chance and was now unfolding with intention, each moment a careful, deliberate step into a connection that neither could yet fully predict but both were beginning to navigate together. The night had fully settled over Manhattan, streetlights casting long ribbons of gold across wet pavements, and Emily Parker felt the weight of the day pressing softly against her shoulders, a mixture of anticipation, apprehension, and the quiet thrill of the unknown. She walked beside Victor Romano, each step measured, mirroring his rhythm without conscious thought, the city around them receding into a blurred backdrop as the intensity of their interaction took precedence. The soft hum of distant traffic, the occasional pedestrian's footsteps, and the muted chatter from a nearby late-night cafe created a gentle soundtrack to a conversation that relied as much on silence and presence as it did on words. Emily's fingers traced the edge of her coat pocket, the warmth from her hands a grounding sensation as her green eyes flicked to Victor's steel blue gaze, noting the calm confidence, the subtle observation in every tilt of his head, every slight shift in posture. They paused at a small square with a single lamppost casting a soft glow over the cobblestones, the fountain in the center murmuring quietly, its gentle sound creating a serene bubble amidst the city's usual clamor. Victor gestured toward a bench with a slight nod, and Emily sat, adjusting herself, feeling the cool wood beneath her and the comforting distance it provided. He leaned back slightly, fingers steepled, observing her with an intensity that was meticulous yet unobtrusive, allowing her space while also signaling a quiet engagement that made her acutely aware of every micro-expression, every subtle shift in energy. "You are aware of everything around you," he said, voice low, resonant, carrying weight without pressure, and Emily nodded subtly, feeling the accuracy of his observation and the deliberate care in the way he addressed her. She sensed a bridge forming in the shared quiet, a rhythm of attention and observation where words were not the only currency of communication, each glance, each pause conveying as much as sentences might in ordinary conversation. The fountain water reflected the amber glow of the lamppost, casting rippling light across the square and creating a soft shimmer on Emily's coat as she shifted slightly, her heartbeat steadying in the measured calm of his presence. Victor's gaze followed the small gestures, the adjustment of her posture, the way she flexed her fingers around the edge of her coat, and in the absence of immediate dialogue, Emily felt the subtle understanding that they were navigating an unspoken agreement, a careful exploration of awareness, attention, and the quiet shaping of interaction. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension in her shoulders ease, appreciating the deliberate pacing, the absence of rush, and the nuanced attention that framed the moment with clarity and anticipation. Around them, the city continued its rhythmic pulse, oblivious to the significance unfolding in the small square, and Emily Parker, seated beside Victor Romano, understood that the trajectory of her evening had shifted irrevocably, guided by deliberate observation, mutual awareness, and the quiet, inevitable unfolding of connection that had begun with a single, accidental message and now hummed with purpose, anticipation, and the subtle promise of transformation.